Before cocaine made him king, a teenage Pablo Escobar watched another empire rise in blood. In the emerald mines of Boyacá, warlords ruled with rifles, not rules. And in their shadows, a young narco learned exactly how to build a fortune and get away with murder. He didn't invent Colombian violence, he inherited it. And what he saw in the hills of Muzo would shape the Medellín Cartel's future. This isn't the story you think it is. This is the war before the drug war. Crack open Latin America's boldest secrets, fact-checked, footnoted, and irresistible. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The boy from Envigado, nobody noticed. He was born in Rio Negro in 1949, but that's just a name on a certificate. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria grew up in Envigado, a working-class suburb that clung to the hills outside Medellín, like bricks on a slope. In the 1950s, it was a furnace of old-school Catholicism and fresh scars from La Violencia, the civil war that had turned cousins into executioners. His father was a farmer, his mother a teacher. Neither could shield him from humiliation. Pablo was smart but poor. The kind of poor that makes you count how many pencils you have left, the kind that makes hunger a constant background hum. At 10, he found his first hustle. After school, he scraped chalk dust off classroom blackboards, packed it into paper twists, and sold it as lime to construction workers. It wasn't the money, it was the thrill of flipping what others overlooked. And it taught him something else. Listen long enough to adults arguing, and you'll know when they're bluffing. You'll know when pride outweighs logic. And more than that, you'll know how to make it cost them. By 13, Pablo was forging diplomas on his mother's typewriter and selling them out of a school bag. By 15, he could name the price of a stolen tombstone in Medellin's Blackstone Bazaar, not because he wanted to be a grave robber, but because he understood a rule that poor kids in broken countries learn faster than anyone. Risk multiplied by nerve equals money. He hadn't found cocaine yet, but he had already found the math. Baptism in green fire. As Pablo Escobar was still a schoolboy in Medellín, Boyacá was already a battlefield. In the remote hills of western Boyacá, a discovery in 1961 would ignite one of Colombia's bloodiest untold wars. A farmhand stumbled upon a cache of brilliant emeralds in a cave near Peñas Blancas. The stones shimmered with an intense green, and their glow would soon darken with blood. The find triggered a frenzy. What had long been an informal trade of gem hunters quickly spiraled into a lucrative, unregulated industry, and the Emerald Rush became a war for territory, power, and fortune. With little state oversight and mountains of cash, local mining bosses, known as patrones, rose as warlords. Infrastructure, justice, and even education flowed through them, not Bogotá. The Emerald Lords built roads and schools. They also built private armies. In the shadows of Muzo, Coscuez, and Borbor, groups like La Pesada ran the mines with the iron grip of mafia families. Bandoleros like Efraín, El Siete Colores, González were hired to secure zones, assassinate rivals, and enforce order, until the state hunted them down in spectacular manhunts, sometimes involving tanks. Emerald wealth made some men kings. Others, like Humberto El Ganso Ariza, went from hired guns to loose cannons, triggering what historians now call the First Green War. As this conflict bled into Bogotá's wealthier neighborhoods, Colombia woke up to a truth Boyacá had long known. Emeralds don't just glisten, they explode. Escobar was paying attention. Though there's no hard evidence that young Pablo ever visited the mines, the Boyacá Wars unfolded during his formative years. The Emerald world offered him an early blueprint: violence as leverage, legitimacy through infrastructure, and the blending of outlaw power with state indifference. Perhaps most importantly, it showed that even a man with blood on his hands could rise to be seen as a businessman, as long as he built schools and fed the poor. That early fascination with emeralds never left him. In the 1980s, as Colombia drowned in cocaine dollars, Escobar's network would tangle itself in the Second Green War, an even deadlier chapter where drug lords, emerald bosses, and paramilitary factions collided. But that story comes later. For now, picture a young narco watching the rise of the Emerald Patrones and understanding that the road to empire wasn't paved with gold. It was carved from green stone, soaked in blood, and guarded by men who shot first and ruled second. As the Emerald War continued, Pablo took notes and transitioned from his illegal tombstone business to new ventures. contraband cigarettes, arcade machines, knockoff electronics ferried through the Darien Gap. Not glamorous, not yet, but it was enough to get him noticed, and soon enough, it would be enough to make him dangerous. From smuggler to marimbero. By the early 70s, the Colombian coastline was humming with a different kind of harvest. The hills of La Guajira weren't growing coffee anymore. They were thick with marijuana, the kind that sparkled in the light and stank like money. Santa Marta Gold. That was the brand name. In Miami, it became legend. The growers were ex-contrabandistas, smugglers who knew every cove and every corrupt port inspector, from Barranquilla to the Keys. They loaded up shrimp trawlers with 100-pound bales, blasted salsa music as they danced barefoot over the cargo, then pointed north into the Caribbean night. The American press painted them as pirate folk heroes. But behind the music and rum, there was a new economy blooming, one that was unregulated, untaxed, and faster than anything legal. A single trawler could net $500,000. And that kind of money had gravity. Pablo didn't grow weed. He didn't need to. He saw something else, the bottleneck. You had farmers on the coast, buyers in the States, and almost no one coordinating in between. That's where he set up shop. He bought a used twin-engine Piper and a few favors from Army air traffic controllers. He didn't fly, not yet. But he knew how to schedule flights, how to grease the right hands, how to get a runway to light up at midnight with no questions asked. He offered growers a deal: pay 5% of your cargo's value, and I'll guarantee the route. That meant bribes, fuel, and enough insurance to keep greedy inspectors quiet, and it worked. Within 2 seasons, Escobar had 3 planes, 2 safe houses near the Caribbean, and something more powerful than cash: the loyalty of peasants in the Bajo Cauca Valley. They called him Dr. Pablo, the man who paid for school repairs, who showed up when no one else did. He understood what the police didn't. Reputation is an investment. A little generosity buys you silence. A few favors buy you a town. By the time American demand began shifting away from weed towards something harder, something whiter, Pablo was ready. He'd built the lanes, hired the drivers, and learned the system. All he needed now was a product that packed more value per kilo. And in the shadows of Peru and Bolivia, that product was already blooming. Cocaine, the accountant's dream. By the mid-1970s, the marijuana trade had gone soft. What once smelled like easy money was now clogging up warehouses and drawing too much heat. American college kids were switching to boutique homegrown strains. The DEA was getting smarter. Shipments were getting seized before they could even cross the Caribbean. Pablo Escobar, who never liked betting on yesterday's odds, was already looking further south, into the jungle, where a new gold rush was bubbling through the highlands of Peru and Bolivia. There, far from the reach of Medellin's radios and Bogotá's headlines, chemists were working magic on a bitter green leaf. Coca, crushed, cooked, and purified into a glittering white powder, it was light, compact, and worth its weight in diamonds. A single kilo of cocaine, pure laboratory grade, could go for more than 15 times what a whole ton of weed would fetch in New York. It was cleaner, faster, and above all, easier to hide. Escobar did the math. That was always his secret weapon. Not just violence, not just charisma. It was his mind. Cocaine didn't just offer bigger profits. It offered a kind of scalability that emeralds and pot never could. He could control the supply chain from the coca fields to the plastic-wrapped bricks flying over the Gulf of Mexico. No middlemen, no guesswork, no ceiling, but he needed infrastructure, labs, planes, chemistry, and the right kind of ally. That's when Carlos Later walked in. Later wasn't like the other traffickers Pablo had met. He was half Colombian, half German, fresh off a stint in a U.S. federal prison where he'd studied the American justice system the way a priest studies scripture. He was theatrical, volatile, a little too eager to quote Hitler and Jefferson in the same breath, but what he lacked in subtlety, he made up for in vision. Later didn't just want to move cocaine, he wanted to rewrite the entire logistics of the Western Hemisphere. He had eyes on a strip of sand in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay. With enough money, it could become a halfway house for drug planes, fuel depot, warehouse, casino, and fortress in one. Pablo had the money, Later had the dream. Together, they formed one of the most profitable and dangerous partnerships in the history of organized crime. Pablo brought in and leftover capital from the Santa Marta runs. First, he reinvested: labs, pilots, routes, lawyers. He started to treat cocaine like a manufacturing business: raw materials, supply lines, distribution, branding. later handled the showmanship. He flew flags, threw parties, played revolutionary. Pablo kept it tight, quiet. He studied which airports had the weakest scanners, which customs agents had kids in private school, which prosecutors had gambling debts. He wasn't just building an empire, he was writing a manual on how to build a narcotics corporation that could outmaneuver a nation state. In less than 2 years, they moved more product than the entire Cali cartel had moved in 5. And Escobar, for the first time in his life, was no longer running behind. He was ahead. He wasn't just supplying demand, he was shaping it. The jungle had taught him how to make cocaine, but the real lesson was bigger than that. It was the realization that chemistry wasn't just in the labs, it was in the structure, the hierarchy, the way each piece of the organization had to interact. Isolated, disciplined, transactional. No one man should ever hold all the cards. Even he wasn't above that rule. He called it compartmentalization. Later joked that it sounded like something out of a submarine manual, but it worked. Escobar made sure no pilot knew where the stash house was. No stash house manager knew where the chemicals were stored. No one ever saw the full picture, except him. It was risk management, cartel style. Every shipment that touched down in Miami made someone rich, but it also bought silence, it bought loyalty, and it bought time. But time, like territory, always runs out. And success, that just puts your face on the wall. The Green Wars lesson revisited. Every booming trade eventually attracts parasites. That's what Pablo Escobar understood before most. Cocaine was no longer a secret whispered in prison yards or jungle bars. It was a stampede. Independent traffickers were popping up all over Medellin. Small-time cowboys, ex-cops with connections, sons of washed-up politicians, even former pilots with too much ego and too little loyalty. The money was magnetic. Everyone wanted in. And that's when Escobar turned back to his first education, the Emerald War. In Boyacá, the mines had taught him the truth about power. The Gonzalez and Ariza clans didn't win because they had better weapons or more men. They won because they understood one thing. If you want to survive, you don't compete. You consolidate. You centralize fear. You make people choose between chaos or your order. So in late 1976, at a nondescript steakhouse outside Medellin called Las Margaritas, Escobar made his move. He called a meeting. Not everyone was invited, only those who mattered. The Ochoa brothers came, ranchers with clean reputations and deeper pockets than anyone guessed. Carlos later flew in, arrogant as ever. José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, El Mexicano, showed up in a black shirt and crocodile boots, and several upstart lieutenants trailed in with the hungry eyes of men who hadn't been shot at yet. There were no speeches. Pablo laid out the terms like a man laying concrete. Pool your muscle. Share your lawyers. Fix wholesale prices. And if someone crosses the line, we don't call the police. We call each other. They didn't call it the Medellín Cartel. Not yet. That name came from journalists and cops. Inside, they simply called it the office. Because it wasn't a gang. It was a business. And now, it had rules. Each man had a job. Escobar handled the logistics. He knew every mile of the Colombian sky and every crooked customs officer from Antioquia to Miami. The Ochoas ran their horse ranches as safe houses and fronted Miami real estate through cousins and nephews. Later controlled the Bahamian corridor, an air bridge of corruption between Norman's Cay and Florida. Rodriguez Gacha brought in the real heat, guns, mercenaries, and a Rolodex full of paramilitary commanders. What they needed now was enforcement, a message. That message arrived on the night Martha Nieves Ochoa was kidnapped. M19 guerrillas thought they'd scored big when they snatched the sister of one of the most powerful families in Colombia. They demanded a ransom, millions, but what they got was something else entirely. Within 48 hours, the new cartel responded with something the country had never seen before. Mas, muerte a secuestradores, death to kidnappers. It was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of war. Over the next month, suspected guerrilla collaborators were dragged from their homes. Bodies appeared with signs pinned to their shirts. No trials, no questions, only retribution. The message wasn't subtle. It was surgical. You touch us, we erase you. The public was horrified. The business class quietly was impressed. Pablo Escobar didn't just rescue Martha Nieves. He cemented the cartel as the invisible government of Colombia's underworld. And he proved that in a country where the legal system had a pulse but no spine, private armies could write their own laws. Mass was a prototype, a dress rehearsal, Because what Pablo really wanted wasn't just to survive in the drug game, he wanted to rule it. But he also understood the paradox. The more power you have, the more visible you become. And once you're visible, you need a mask. That came next. And it was likely due to Gacha's power in the Emerald region that resulted in the Second Emerald War. This one Pablo Escobar chose to join. In the rugged hills of Boyacá, Colombia's emerald heartland, two rival factions clashed in a war with no front lines, just ambushes, assassinations, and silence. By the mid-1980s, the Second Green War was in full swing, and this time, Pablo Escobar wasn't just watching, he was in it. At the center of the conflict stood two power blocks, the traditionalist miners of Coscuez, led by Luis Murcia, El Pequinez, and the insurgent forces of Borbor, bankrolled by rising emerald tycoon Victor Carranza and his partner, Gilberto Molina. The struggle wasn't just over stones, it was about control, over territory, over supply routes, over who lived and who vanished in the foggy hills. To tip the scales, Molina revived a deadly alliance with his old friend and Escobar associate, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, El Mexicano. Gacha, now a top player in the cocaine trade, didn't hesitate. He poured in money and paramilitary muscle, seizing the moment to expand his drug empire through Boyacá's chaotic terrain. And while Escobar never set foot in the mines himself, this was no distant affair. Gacha was Escobar's man. The Medellín Cartel had long relied on him for muscle and logistics. But now, as Gacha dug deep into emerald turf and demanded stakes in the mines, cracks appeared in the cartel's foundations. When Carranza and Molina couldn't repay a $70 million loan to Gacha, he demanded ownership. That was a move Escobar couldn't ignore. Suddenly, his associate was becoming too powerful, controlling emeralds, cocaine, and an armed network. Medellín took note. Behind the scenes, Escobar helped orchestrate a betrayal. Cocaine plantations linked to Gacha surfaced on Carranza's land. Blame shifted to a supposed tenant. Then came anonymous tips to the DEA. In 1989, Gilberto Molina was gunned down in a bloodbath known as the Sasaima Massacre. Months later, Gacha himself was killed in a military operation, an attack reportedly aided by intel from Emerald insiders and Medellín rivals. Escobar had learned what he needed. The Emerald War taught him how private armies, fake legitimacy, and violence disguised as business could shape entire regions. But it also showed the price of unchecked ambition and the danger of letting partners become threats. In 1990, with Gacha gone and bodies piled high, Carranza and El Pequinez signed a peace treaty. Escobar, too, entered his short-lived political phase, offering to pay Colombia's debt, running for office, even proposing peace. But beneath the calm, he had already absorbed the Green War's blueprint. Monopolize the supply chain, build your own justice, and when a friend becomes too strong, pull the trigger. The hills of Boyacá didn't just supply emeralds. They gave Escobar his playbook. Building the Robin Hood myth power attracts cameras. But survival? That requires a mask. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer a whisper in the underworld. He was a name, a brand, a target. The airstrips were still humming, the labs still running, but the media was beginning to sniff around the edges of his empire. Too many shipments, too many assassinations brushed off with silence. The heat was rising, so Escobar pivoted, not in business, but in image. If they were going to talk about him, he'd decide how. He began in the barrios where broken streets and broken promises were older than the country's independence. Places like Moravia and Santo Domingo, where sewage ran through alleys and roofs were patched with plastic. Places politicians only visited when the cameras were rolling. Pablo didn't just show up, he delivered. He paved roads before the city did. He built soccer fields where trash heaps had stood. He handed out school supplies and medicine like a visiting saint. When a child needed surgery abroad, he paid for the plane ticket and held the mother's hand. Every move was calibrated, personal, and public. He didn't want to seem like a businessman or a gangster. He wanted to be a savior. The media took the bait. Articles began referring to him as El Robin Hood Paisa. The poor called him Dr. Pablo. Mothers blessed him, teachers praised him, even priests shook his hand, grateful for roof repairs and full pews. He clipped every headline and sent them to politicians, tucked into fruit baskets, always with a thank you card, a reminder, you may work in Bogota, but your voters pray to me. When a flood wiped out a low-income neighborhood in Itagüí, Escobar didn't wait for FEMA. He personally funded 200 new homes, simple cinder block boxes, but they had electricity, plumbing, and most importantly, keys. Each one came with a plastic keychain bearing his smiling face. It wasn't just housing, it was loyalty carved in concrete. Soon he started sponsoring youth tournaments, music festivals, cooking contests. He even paid for gravedigger fees for the poorest widows in town. If someone buried their husband and couldn't afford the plot, Pablo Escobar covered it, and he made sure everyone knew. He understood something no politician ever dared say out loud: you don't have to fix everything, just fix what hurts most. That buys more faith than speeches ever could, and it worked. By 1982, his image was so polished that even Colombia's Liberal Party, yes, the same party of lawyers, reformers, and career statesmen, welcomed him onto the ticket. He won a seat as an alternate congressman. He walked into the Capitol not as a suspect, but as a peer, a man with power, a man with a tie, a man who knew how to keep his past off the record and his donations off the books. In the cloakrooms of Congress, he learned something cocaine had never taught him: how cheap a vote could be when you anesthetize public opinion with hope. With Escobar, loyalty wasn't about fear, not always. It was about gratitude. The poor saw him as their only real ally. The rich saw him as a necessary evil. The media, at least the ones who weren't already bought, saw a contradiction they couldn't quite solve. Was he a bandit with a heart or a tyrant in disguise? Pablo Escobar didn't care what they called him, so long as they didn't call him guilty, but that was about to change. Congress, cocaine, and the first shot. In the polished hallways of Bogotá's Capitol building, Pablo Escobar looked like just another politician. He wore the suit, he shook the hands. He nodded through speeches and whispered into ears with the smooth confidence of a man who'd already memorized every chess piece on the board. But behind that smile, behind the headlines calling him a progressive businessman, the truth was rotting under the surface. Escobar was still moving tons of cocaine, still bankrolling armed protection squads, still laundering millions through construction firms that never poured a drop of cement. And someone was about to call his bluff. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla didn't buy the Robin Hood myth. He didn't believe that a man with Pablo's background suddenly got rich selling used cars and real estate. He started digging, and what he found made his blood run cold. Photos, customs reports, shipping manifests. Witness statements from the Tranquilandia lab seizure in Meta. Then came the smoking gun, a blurry photograph of Escobar himself loading bricks of cocaine onto a twin-engine plane back in 1976. Rodrigo Lara took it public. He stood in front of cameras, held up the photo, and declared, "This man does not belong in Congress. He belongs in prison." That night, the phone lines in Bogotá lit up. Lara's police escorts were offered briefcases, envelopes, cash transfers. "Walk away," the voice on the other end said. "This isn't your fight." They refused. 3 weeks later, in the fading light of a Bogotá evening, Lara's white Mercedes rolled through a narrow street. 2 motorcycles pulled up alongside. The first fired 3 shots through the driver's side window. The second finished the job with a burst from a MAC-10. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla died on the spot. His blood splattered across a speech he never got to deliver, one about corruption and accountability. It was the first time Escobar had openly crossed a line he could never uncross. A government minister, a national figure, a man with a family, a future, a cabinet post, gone, executed in traffic. The message was clear: no one was untouchable. But Escobar had miscalculated. Colombia, embarrassed before the world, snapped into retaliation mode. President Belisario Betancourt, who had once cautiously entertained whispers of negotiation, now slammed the door shut. U.S. intelligence agencies, already tracking Pablo's routes through Florida, doubled their resources. Colombian lawmakers began drafting extradition agreements with Washington. For the first time, the word narcoterrorismo entered the national conversation. But inside the cartel, the reaction was different. Rodrigo Lara's murder didn't scare them, it bonded them. Escobar paid the legal fees for every pilot, mule, and middleman arrested during the raids that followed. He sent flowers to their families, paid for funerals, covered bail. He had already anticipated the crackdown and prepared for it. He increased security for his inner circle, replacing ex-cops with ex-soldiers. He supplied rifles to the Ochoa brothers and gave Rodriguez Gacha access to his lawyers. Everyone in the Medellín Cartel understood what had just happened. The honeymoon was over, the gloves were off, but now they were no longer playing defense. They were a state within a state, and they had just issued their declaration of war, accounting for a fortune. By 1984, the Medellín Cartel wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was an economy. Pablo Escobar sat at the center of it all, not like a drug lord, but like a CEO, running one of the most profitable private operations on earth. His product was cocaine. His clients were Americans. His enforcement was private. His budget, roughly $1.2 billion a year. That number didn't come from myths. It came from ledgers, real ones, handwritten in green ink, kept in locked drawers across multiple farms and stash houses. These weren't just records, they were blueprints, the math of a criminal state. 40% of revenue went straight back into operations, labs, chemicals, pilots, engineers, and the bribes that made all of it fly under the radar. Planes needed fuel. Border guards needed birthdays remembered. For every busted load, 2 others made it through, greased by well-timed handshakes and 6-digit envelopes. 30% got laundered through front companies, shell corporations, cattle ranches, pharmacies, and fake real estate developments. Entire neighborhoods were being built as money laundering funnels, slums dressed as infrastructure, with cash hidden in concrete. Another 10% was stashed offshore, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, the Cayman Islands. Extradition insurance, Escobar called it. If the state came knocking, that was his escape fund, his golden parachute. 10% went to optics, funding his reputation. That meant public works, soccer tournaments, disaster relief, food drives. Every dollar spent on a widow's funeral or a school roof doubled as protection money, too. The people he fed wouldn't betray him. In fact, they'd shield him. And the last 10%, liquid. Vacuum-sealed bundles buried in oil drums across Antioquia, hidden under mango trees and beside irrigation pumps. Emergency cash that only he and his most trusted men could find. The kind of money you need when everything else collapses. The details were meticulous. Congressman X, 120,000 pesos. Runway lighting repairs, 18,000. Feeding the zoo on his estate in Puerto Triunfo, yes, the one with the hippos, 7,000. Once, when a stash drum in the jungle was opened and $2 million had been gnawed away by rats, Escobar didn't flinch. Tax for the jungle, he shrugged. There was no financial model for what he was doing, no textbook, no MBA program that covered how to fund a civil war while buying votes and dodging radar. But Escobar didn't need Wall Street. He had Medellín, where a kilo of cocaine was more stable than the peso. The system worked because he made it work. And because everyone, from air traffic controllers to senators, had learned the same equation he had learned as a boy in Envigado. Risk times nerve equals cash. The bigger the risk, the higher the payout. The higher the payout, the more people you could buy. And the more people you bought, the lower the risk. That was Pablo Escobar's formula. That was the engine behind the Medellín Cartel. And it was still just getting warmed up. Fatal equations. By 1991, the facade was gone. Whatever fantasy still clung to the image of Pablo Escobar had been burned off by the heat of his own war. The Medellín Cartel was splintering. Allies were dead, jailed, or making quiet phone calls to prosecutors. Carlos later, the madman of Norman's Cay, was rotting in a Florida prison under a life sentence. Rodriguez Gacha, El Mexicano, had been hunted and gunned down in a sugarcane field with his son beside him. The Ochoa brothers were at the negotiation table, ready to trade their mansions for lighter sentences. But Escobar wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He still believed in his own design, and for good reason. Everything he had built, from the coca fields of Meta to the congressional floor in Bogotá, had been stitched together with a formula few ever understood. He didn't invent it. He just weaponized it. Power equals money plus fear multiplied by narrative. That formula had protected him for years. It made judges hesitate. It turned civilians into loyalists. It corrupted entire precincts without a single bullet fired. But now, the numbers weren't holding. The government was done negotiating. The Americans wanted him in chains. Rival cartels, especially in Cali, were smelling blood in the water. Even within Medellín, former allies were weighing their odds, calculating how much they stood to lose if Pablo fell, and how much they could gain if they helped tip the scales. He needed a play, one more move. What he did next was bold even by his standards. He surrendered, but not to prison, not exactly. He struck a deal with the government. He would turn himself in, serve time, and stop the bombing campaign, but only on his terms. The state agreed to it, out of exhaustion, fear, or cowardice, maybe all three. And so in 1991, Pablo Escobar walked into a prison he had built with his own hands. They called it La Catedral, but it wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. Perched on a mountain with a view of Medellin, it had a soccer field, a jacuzzi, a bar, and an outdoor barbecue pit. There were no guards inside, only Escobar's men. The state's presence ended at the gate. He was both inmate and warden. Inside La Catedral, he kept ruling. Shipments still moved. Rivals still disappeared. Politicians still received envelopes with quiet suggestions. But cracks were forming. One of his own lieutenants betrayed him, tried to skim from the top. Escobar had him tortured and executed inside the prison. When the story leaked, the public exploded. The government, shamed, embarrassed, pressured, revoked the deal. The next morning, the cell was empty. Escobar had vanished. For the next 18 months, he became a ghost. Colombia was a country hunting its own reflection. The bloc de búsqueda chased shadows. Phone calls were tapped. Relatives were interrogated. Safe houses were raided. But every time they got close, he slipped through a tunnel, a farmhand, a bribe, a whisper. Then, December 2nd, 1993, Medellin. A call is traced, a location is confirmed, a rooftop, a cornered man with a pistol in his belt, and a voice on the phone trying to say goodbye to his son. 3 shots, one to the leg, one to the torso, and one behind the ear. The king fell. But this isn't a story about how he died. It's a story about what he built, and why pieces of it still survive. Lessons unburied. Pablo Escobar has been dead for over 30 years, but walk through certain neighborhoods in Medellin or scroll through certain corners of the internet and you'll feel it. The shadow's still there. It lingers in the way people whisper his name, in the way some still call him El Patron with a strange kind of reverence, like he was something more than a man, like he was a formula that worked, because that's what he was. Escobar didn't just invent a drug empire, he invented a system, a blueprint, one that outlived him and outgrew Colombia. Today, the playbook he pioneered, vertical integration of narcotics, political corruption masked as public charity, private armies disguised as populist militias, echoes across the globe. From the Sinaloa Mountains to the jungles of Myanmar, from Rio's favelas to Africa's Sahel. The actors change, the accents change, but the math stays the same. Risk times nerve equals cash. Cash buys silence. Silence buys space. Space becomes power. And power, once it reaches a certain volume, doesn't ask permission anymore. It declares itself. Escobar was the first to prove that in a failed state, or even just a tired one, a well-funded outlaw with charm, guns, and an iron sense of narrative can rival the government. Not just resist it, rival it, replace it, outlove it in the eyes of the people it forgot. That's the real lesson. Not the bombs, not the billions, not the hippos or the houses or the graves. It's the void. Escobar filled a vacuum the state had ignored. Where politicians gave promises, he gave keys. Where police gave warnings, he gave food. Where ministers sent speeches, he sent bulldozers. And he made sure every bag of cement carried his face. His genius wasn't cocaine. It was storytelling. He convinced the world he was something more than a criminal. He became a myth. And myths are hard to kill, even when you put 3 bullets in them. So, next time you hear someone call a narco Robin Hood, next time you see a drug lord hand out food during a flood or build a school in a slum, remember what's missing behind the camera. Remember the morgues, the judges, the sons and daughters left picking up the pieces. Remember the mask he built, the state he hijacked. And ask yourself, who's learning that math now? Gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If you uncovered a new clue today, like, share, and hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. Drop your theories below, and until then, keep the legends alive and the facts on fire. Nos vemos en la próxima crónica.